Sex. It occupies a good part of our psyches, engaging our thoughts and influencing our behaviors. It's been around forever, always baffling, and now it's changing. Cloning for reproduction, virtual sex for recreation, erotic adventures on the internet. Sex is diversifying into a brave new world of biochemical procreation and electronic stimulation. But is something missing here? Next, on Closer to Truth, does sex have a future? Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm Robert Kuhn. Where is sex going? To assess its future, we need to understand its nature. To help us do that, we are joined by Dr. Paul Abramson, who is professor of psychology at UCLA and a leading authority on modern sexuality. Dr. Vern Bullough, a medical historian, has written over 50 books that give broad cultural views of sexual practices. Dr. Cliff Penner is a clinical psychologist, a sex therapist practicing in the Christian community, and an author with his wife, Joyce. Dr. Gregory Stock is a biomedical scientist and author of The Book of Questions. And Joyce Penner is a clinical nurse, sex therapist, and author with her husband, Cliff. Paul is a renowned sex researcher at UCLA and author of many books, Sexual Nature, Sexual Change being one of them. You're an expert witness in prominent legal cases involving sex. What kinds of sexual lawsuits today affect public policy? What's their implication for the future? 30 seconds.
Well, the colloquial phrase is sexpert witness. And I enter into every domain that influences both the expression of sexuality in terms of the behaviors, in terms of our speech, in terms of, in some way, our fantasy level and the way it plays itself out on things like the internet, as well as the manner in which we protect people about their sexuality, how we protect people from sexual harms, the abuse, the rape, the harassment, and so on. And all of those things are very highly regulated, and all those things come under the rubric of the legal domain.
Vern, you're a medical historian, sex researcher, author of many books such as Sexual Attitudes, Myths and Realities. Give us an assessment of the historical understanding of sex and the misunderstanding.
Well, all we know is that sex did exist because we're all here. But in essence, there's been a tremendous amount of misunderstanding ranging from things as to what causes pregnancy, what kind of sex is permissible, culture's different. Actually, there's even time period differences. Sometimes, for example, masturbation has been all right, but other times it hasn't. Sometimes there's very little talk about premarital sex, other times there's more. And cultures vary tremendously on it. All you can say about sex in the past is it's there, and everything that we do today was done then.
Cliff, you and your wife Joyce are sex therapists in the Christian tradition, which generally has avoided open discussions about sex in the past. What's been the reaction of your community, Christian community, to your very open and honest approach to sex? One of your books, 52 Ways How to Have Fun, Fantastic Sex. 52, you're not limiting sex to once a week, are you?
Absolutely not.
Okay, I was worried about that.
Yeah. Well, the response has really been pretty wide open, and it really grows out of the great need there is out there. You see, we're really applied people. We're not doing too much in the theory realm. We're out there working with the people who are struggling with their sexual lives, and in the Christian community, that's particularly where there is such a strongly felt need, because there are so many people struggling in their marriages.
But are there complaints that you're dealing so openly with subjects in your books?
We get some complaints, but most of the time we just go places where we're invited and they welcome us.
Well, you're invited here.
Well, thank you.
Greg, you are head of UCLA's program in medicine, technology, and society, where one of your main objectives is to look at the future. When you look out at the horizon, what do you see for sex?
Well, I think it's going to be, there are going to be a great, real powerful forces that come down on sex to change it, with the potential for changing it. The first is that reproduction and sex are going to be further separated. The second is that this is a very powerful drive, and that it's going to further pervade everything we do in terms of the advertising and the multiplication of those sorts of things.
So sex is going to even more pervade society than it does today?
I think so, because just as we can see on the internet, it's become dominant on the internet in a very short period of time, which creates pulls that are going to be difficult for people to deal with, for men to deal with when they can get immediate gratification of various sorts, even if it's only in a limited way. And then we'll have pharmaceuticals that create arousal, the kinds of things that are derivatives of Viagra-like drugs. So it's going to be a very complicated situation.
All right, let's stick with the high tech. Paul, I want to explore the nature of fantasy, which obviously is very much involved with sexuality, in a high-tech world. What's happening to fantasy when we have all these overt expressions of sexuality?
Well, I think the capacity for fantasy is shrinking. I think what the high-tech world...
That's the opposite of what you'd think. You'd think that with all this stuff going on, fantasy is greater.
Well, but these are things that are substitutes for it. If you look at every high-tech innovation that's been incorporated or assimilated sex, from photography to the VCR revolution to dial-a-port to virtual sex on the internet, these are basically ways of co-opting the internal fantasy life and are primarily adjuncts to male masturbation. So these are basically high-tech ways of masturbating. So instead of stroke films, these are stroke bites or whatever.
Joyce, you and your husband have written many books on sexuality. Men and Sex is one of your latest books. With all of us men here yapping away for the last couple of seconds, what is your perspective as a female? Does that give you a different perspective, or is it pretty much the same?
I think we add a different perspective, and we as women bring the complexity. We bring the unpredictableness and the ever-changingness. If you ever want to try to figure out a woman, you figure out, men want to get it down to a formula and figure us out, and you can't do that.
You're more complex. Does that make us more simple?
That's right. And so that dimension is necessary as part of this whole formula.
Yeah. How does this issue of fantasy come up? Do you find in your counseling that today, with the internet and various things happening, that people's fantasy life is changing?
Well, all of us are designed with the capacity for imagination and imagery in the brain. And so when we're not using that and creating those fantasies, we and are just replacing them with something simple, we don't use our brain to create that. And that fantasy can be something that enhances a sexual relationship between a husband and wife if it is used in that vein, in that perspective, rather than something that distracts.
It reminds me of the old joke about women have a sixth sense of whether men are going to have sex tonight or not. Mm-hmm. And that women regulate in some ways, and this is true not only of humans but other primates. Women are the gatekeepers of sexuality.
We are. George Gilder has written about that in terms of men and marriage, anthropologist who has studied that we are many times the gatekeepers in a necessary role.
Bert?
Well, you know, you're talking about fantasy, but I think we need to talk about technology, which has also radically changed things and that will continue to change things. The obvious ones are, of course, the pill. But what I'm fascinated by is how you can live your fantasy, in a sense, in a different way. I speak, for example, of transsexuals. Technology has made it possible to change sex legally and, in a sense, anatomically. And hormones have made it possible so that this change is more realistic than it was in the past. We've always had people who are eunuchs who are castrated, but they didn't adopt the role of the other sex because they lacked the hormones.
Well, it becomes possible also for these communities to link up and to form essential subcultures, which has been very difficult to do in the past. So this sort of externalization of our fantasies and allowing a linking up of people based upon